My work is specifically in South Asia, India, um, and I want to talk today actually about voting. And I want to talk. I think it's a topical subject for those of us who are in the U.S. right now, but I want to talk about it connected to gender inequality, but also gender violence in India and the ways in which these things all connect. Um, at I'm as you all know, we're coming up on 100 years of women's suffrage in the United States, which is 1919 when women got the right to vote. What's interesting, of course, is that the women's right to vote in the U.S. is also, of course, associated with a large conversation about the abolition of slavery, which is the abolition of slavery, which really galvanized many of the activists in it to start thinking about women's suffrage. Um, and it's a very interesting, crucial juncture for American history because it's really when these abolitionists, most of whom were also women, realized that if they abolish slavery, then the black man will have the vote before the white woman. So we have this interesting kind of racist caricature or racist understanding of the ways in which these things come about, but these are our complicated, complex histories. And I think it's important to understand that. I begin with that example, of course, because I voted a few days ago, and it's really important for me because I voted for the first time in my life. I came to the United States at the age of 18, and India did not have an absentee ballot. So since I came here at 18, I did not have a vote in India, but I did not become a US citizen till last year, so I did not have a vote in the United States. So actually, I voted for the first time in my life in this election. And I feel like it's also the fight of our lives in this election as well. But I say that this is important for me because, of course, I didn't have a vote and I began to think about voting in a large way. But women from 1947, when India achieved independence, had the right to vote. So unlike many countries in which women really had to fight and ask for the right to vote, in India from 1947 onward, women did have the right to vote. However, if their right to vote meant that they could vote is a whole different question for us, which is that rights, and which is what I want to really highlight today, is the question of what is on paper as we talk about human rights, as we talk about rights, especially gender. It's very important for me that we really have a sense of the ways in which legislative rights do not necessarily translate into actual social rights. In the US especially, we have a very rights-based narrative of most social movements. The right to vote, the right to same-sex marriage to be recognized, the right for women, the right for this. But in a way, most social movements in the United States context have actually been a movement to achieve rights. And that being in a kind of understood trajectory in which once the rights are achieved, that means that group is recognized, that means you're in the system, that means somehow you're then able to get on with the other rights and the other things that come with it, which is not just social recognition, civil rights, so on and so forth. But I want to bring up the example of India to say that it's a long road between just achieving rights and having rights, by which I mean having legal rights and actual rights. So for example, women in India had voting rights in 1947. Abortion has been legal in India for a long time, but the history of reproductive rights in India is also complicated with male preference, given that it has led to a disproportionate number of female fetuses aborted rather than male fetuses, right? The economist Amartya Sen, of course, did a large analysis of this and said that 1 million women were missing in India because of male preference. So I really want to use my time to highlight the ways in which we need to really think about, as Dr. Karakaya Stump brought to us the plight of the Alevis in Turkey, but to really talk about the ways in which internationalizing and thinking about these subjects outside the US context really actually even allows us to understand the US context better. As we are worried now, as people are talking about Roe v. Wade, all of the other things that go along with it in terms of gender and reproductive rights in this country, interestingly enough, I was, in a group of feminists talking about something when they said, oh, there's not really much to say about abortion. It's people are either pro or against. Um, and the interesting thing for me was that actually there is a lot more to say about this when you take the context out of the US. So, for example, in terms of India, abortion has always been legal. However, male preference has exacerbated the context of female feticide, and where more girls and female fetuses have been aborted than male fetuses. So these contexts are very interesting, and I think complex issues for us to think about in the term of gender inequality. My work specifically right now is on gendered violence. And once again, when I speak about gender violence in South Asia, in India, people almost always bring up questions of religion, tradition, culture. And my aim with my project at this point in time with gendered violence in India is actually to take the conversation away from culture and religion and tradition and bring the conversation to modernity and economy. It's no accident that in the last 20 years, as India's economy liberalized and more women entered the workforce in recognized formal sectors. I'm not talking about informal sectors. Women have always worked around the world in informal sectors. But in formal sectors, as women entered the workforce, it led to a greater kind of struggle, a greater conflict in terms of access to public space. And for me, gender violence right now really encompasses all of these other things. People, of course, talk about rape, people talk about assault and sexual violence in this context. Accumulation or a culmination of all of these things, from voting rights to having rights to female fetuses to the ways in which women have to, integrate. And I hate to use the word, but the ways in which women have to actually integrate every sexism in their life. I consider that a slow violence. I consider that an aspect of the ways in which women specifically, and I'm talking about specifically India here, have had to deal with all of these other things. So for example, if we think about, you mentioned my work, which was on women warriors and others, India has a great history of women as leaders, of women as goddesses, of women in history, so on and so forth. But a very bad record of women in ordinary lives. And it's my aim in my work is really to highlight the challenges that women have to face in many societies in the everyday life. The focus on extraordinary women almost always takes us out of the conversation of the ordinary. I want to finish off by really talking about a case of gendered violence in India that everybody's pretty much familiar with, which is the 2012 Delhi rape case, where a young woman was brutalized, terribly brutalized, and then left for dead on the road. Of course, as the public galvanized in India to ask the state and the government and others to change things around, because rape victims in India are not named, she was given various names as they began to talk about her in the media. One of the names given to her was Nirbhay, which means without fear. Another word given to her was amanat, which means treasure, right? And I really began to, when I heard these words, I began to think once again about this tradition of narrativizing women's experience, in which the idea of making this young woman nirbhay, without fear, to me was almost a travesty. To take her out of the ordinary aspect of everyday life in which women face violence and to somehow put her in this category of someone who was extremely brave, who did not feel fear. I imagine she felt a great deal of fear. But by calling her someone without fear, we were once again pushing her into a pantheon of heroines and goddesses and not paying attention to the ways in which women face violence in their everyday life. By thinking of this woman as amanat, by thinking of her as a treasure of the nation, we were once again talking about women as treasured objects, as treasured aspects of society, rather than thinking about them as citizens, as people, as normal, everyday human beings who must have the same recourse to justice and to dignity in their lives as everybody else. And I've, of course, focused on women, but as soon as you layer religion and in India, caste, and then transgendered and other identities and ethnic identities upon a gendered aspect of each human being's life, we, of course, then have these kind of multiple marginalizations with which we contend. So, I just want to talk, I wanted to bring up a few examples by which to really complicate. It's not so much my issue, my aim here to think about the ways in which I want to introduce people to a certain aspect of gendered violence or gender inequalities in the world, but rather to actually, which I hope everybody knows that there are gendered inequalities in the world, but rather to complicate the conversation about gendered inequalities, right? So that we really begin to think about the ways in which what we think is our everyday is really complicated by our attention to somebody else's everyday. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was happy to be here. And human rights is absolutely worth the fight. Thank you.